Good morning. My name is Murray, one of the pastors here at Grace Fellowship, and glad to be here. Feel a little disconnected after being in kids 2 weeks ago, and then we were away in Alberta for a wedding on top of a mountain, outdoors on a mountain in November, and we did that wedding there for a couple of adventurers. So it was quite the time. So glad to be here. On my right, your left is Lana. She's going to be interpreting in ASL this morning as we look into the book of Hosea. Now, all the Hebrew Old Testament prophets, they prophesied of the coming of the Messiah. And of course, Christians believe that the Messiah was born at Christmas. So each Sunday here in December, we're going to actually take a look at a different one of the Hebrew minor prophets. They're called minor, not because they're less important, but because they're actually a little shorter in length. But we're only going to look at a few of them. There's actually 12 minor prophets in the Old Testament scriptures in total. But we're going to look at a few of them, and we're going to look at what that prophet has to say to prepare really for the coming of the Messiah, even as we prepare for Christmas, so that we might better know and love Jesus ourselves. Now, the minor prophets, they've got those difficult names, right? Like you got Habakkuk, you've got Haggai, you've got Zephaniah, you've got Malachi, or if you're Italian, you'll call him Malachi. But the minor prophets, they were written after Israel, for the most part, had really turned its back on God. They basically were just now starting to just go through the religious motions. And so in these prophetic writings, God is going to lay out his plan for restoration for a sinful and rebellious people. He's going to point them to a coming Messiah, a Savior who would bring healing and actually redeem what their sin had messed up. So if you want to know how to put a life back together after your sin has messed it up, then these books are for you. Plus, if you're a Christian, one day in the new creation, you're bound to run into Nahum or Zechariah or Hosea, and they're going to ask you, how did you like my book? Did you receive its intended help for you on your journey? Right? And if you've never read it, it's going to be really awkward and embarrassing, so we're trying to save you from that. So, the one we're going to look at this morning is Hosea. Hosea is the very first of the minor prophets as they appear in the Bible. So if you've got little trouble finding it, it's going to come after Daniel. There'll be some long ones like Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. And Hosea is the one we're going to focus on. And it's going to set the stage for really all of the other minor prophets and what they have to say to come. And Hosea is going to tell us about the one who is to come, and he's going to do it through the account of his messed up marriage, which is going to really give us a very mind-blowing view into the heart of God. So here's a portion of then the book of Hosea from chapters 1 and chapter 3. We're going to have it on the screen as well, but if you can find Hosea in your app or in your Bible to follow along, it'll be great. So here's our scripture.
Reading from Hosea chapter 1, verses 1 to 11. The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. When the Lord first spoke through Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, Go, take to yourself a wife of whoredom, and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord. So he went and took Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. And the Lord said to him, Call his name Jezreel, for in just a little while I will punish the house of Jehu for the blood of Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of the house of Israel. And on that day I will break the bow of Israel in the valley of Jezreel. She conceived again and bore a daughter, and the Lord said to him, Call her name No Mercy, for I will no more have mercy on the house of Israel to forgive them at all. But I will have mercy on the house of Judah, and I will save them by the Lord their God. I will not save them by bow, or by sword, or by war, or by horses, or by horsemen. When she had weaned No Mercy, she conceived and bore a son. And the Lord said, Call his name not my people, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Yet the number of the children of Israel shall be like the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured or numbered. And in the place where it was said to them, You are not my people, it shall be said to them, Children of the living God. And the children of Judah and the children of Israel shall be gathered together, and they shall appoint for themselves one head. And they shall go up from the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. Reading from Hosea chapter 3, verses 1 to 3. And the Lord said to me, Go again, love a woman who is loved by another man and is an adulteress, even as the Lord loves the children of Israel, though they turn to other gods and love cakes of raisins. So I bought her for 15 shekels of silver, and a homer, and a lathek of barley. And I said to her, You must dwell as mine for many days. You shall not play the whore, or belong to another man. So will I also be to you.
So thanks for the reading of that, so I didn't have to try to pronounce all those names. I appreciate it. So let's get started. So, lesson 1. Our relationship with God, this text is telling us, in fact, the whole book of Hosea is telling us, is like a marriage. And so right in the very beginning, the first 2 verses of chapter 1, God basically says to Hosea, Go love an unfaithful woman as I love the children of Israel, and take her as your wife. So in other words, Hosea, God is saying, you and I both, we're going to give our hearts to people who utterly reject us, and we're going to give our lives to win them back. So it's you and me, bud. You and me. We're going to end this together. Now, there's a lot of images that God uses throughout the Bible to describe the relationship he has. You've got kings and subjects. You've got shepherds with sheep. You've got father and children. And they all bring out different aspects of the relationship that God wants with us. And now, in this case, he's going to use marriage, just to show how deep and intimate and binding and enduring that he wants our relationship with him to be. Now, we're not going to fully really understand God nor his love for us, nor will we understand sin unless we understand Jesus as our bridegroom. And the image of marriage as God's relationship with his people is used throughout the prophets especially. So why marriage? Well, I'm going to suggest 3 reasons. One, I think, is that marriage is a covenant relationship of priority. So first of all, when God says, I'm like your husband, our relationship is like a marriage, he is saying to us that I am the ultimate priority. You can't simply have me as an add-on. I'm not just a vitamin supplement or an energy drink, right, to get you over the hump when you've got troubles. My relationship with you, your relationship with me, God is saying must be the number 1 priority of your life. Nothing can come before that. Everything else has to come second. Everything has got to get ditched for that. Secondly, marriage is a covenant relationship of intimacy, which means God says, I want a relationship that's like a marriage. You can't know me from afar. You can't sort of just know me in some sort of formal way. I have to be in every nook and cranny of your life. There can't be any part that you hold back from me. So he says, you can't just know about me. You actually have to experience my love. Whatever else our relationship is, and it's many other things, but there has to be a real sense of love in your heart. There has to be a genuine personal connection. You have to experientially know him because we're married. Thirdly, marriage is a covenant relationship of changing power. Because for better or for worse, your spouse actually has a lot of power. Has the power to lift you up, has the power to hurt you like no other. Because if I come home and my neighbor comes out and he says, you idiot, I want nothing to do with you. You know, and I go, yeah, guy's drunk again, and go on in the house, right? But if my wife says it, it's devastating. It's devastated, right? As a bridegroom rejoices over his bride, so I rejoice over you. That's what God reveals about himself in Isaiah 62. And I've got to perform a lot of weddings. Not all of them been on a mountainside. There's been a couple. Thanks to Matt and Eric, it was my first mountainside wedding. Got another one then. I'm glad yours wasn't in November. And happens in performing weddings, I get to actually see grooms rejoice over their bride. And I've got the best seat in the house. I get to see it right up close. And I get to see their eyes tear up when that bride first comes into view. And I get to see there for that moment where the groom just forgets that all the rest of us are even there. And he is just focused then on that bride. And I can see with every fiber of his being, he just wants to run right down there, and he wants to sweep her up in his arms and run off with her, and he's just willing to lay down his life for her. But they always just stand there with a stupid grin. But I know that's what they feel on the inside, right? And Jesus says the most incredible moments, the most incredible marriages in all the history of the world, they're just dim hints of my love for you. And if you grasp that, and if you come to understand my delight in you, God says, with both your mind and your heart, that'll be the most life-changing power in your life. This covenant love of God is directed to his covenant community of faith, his people who belong to him through the blood of Jesus. So lesson number 2. Lesson 1 was our relationship with God is like a marriage, but lesson 2 is our relationship with God is like a bad marriage. So in verses 2 and 3, God says to Hosea, and he comes to him and he says, Hosea, you see this woman over here named Gomer. I want you to marry her. Well, now her name should have been his first clue of how this was going to go down. That should have been a warning. And I think this has to be, if you think of the prophet Hosea, this has to be one of the worst ministry assignments ever given. Some of his friends, maybe they're getting to pastor mega churches and things, and he gets called to marry a woman who's going to prostitute herself in order to illustrate how Israel acted like a whore by forsaking the Lord and worshiping other gods. But God actually put it in his heart to love her. And spiritual adultery is probably God's most primary illustration of sin. Because few things tear your heart to pieces as much as adultery. Because adultery is a betrayal of love. Adultery is when you give to someone else what you should give to or what you should find in your spouse. And when Israel got scared, when they got into financial trouble, rather than turning to God, they ended up running down to Egypt or Assyria or someone else for help. Now, that may not sound immoral unless you recognize that they had replaced God as their trust. And our primary sin is that we let other things take the place that God is actually supposed to have in our hearts. So, where do you turn to when you're worried? Where do you turn to when you're stressed? Alcohol? Weed? Justifying because now it's legal? Shopping? But see, the root sin, and thus the primary sin, is not the drunkenness, it's not the excess spending, it's the fact that you actually are turning to something else for comfort rather than the promises and love of God. If we trust in money for our security instead of trusting God with our future, then you won't be able to be generous in your giving. You won't give God of the first fruits of your money because that's what you're depending upon for your future. So Jesus' church at best gets the leftovers, right? And when you do that, you reveal your real immorality. And that's that your trust and love that you should be putting into God, you've put into money or you've put into whatever else it might be. But God was to be our joy and delight and confidence. But like Israel and like this prostitute, we sought those things in something or someone else. And our betrayal of God broke his heart. And Hosea is going to help us understand this, and he's going to understand this like no one else on the planet. And his life is here to actually help us understand the heart of God. So let's not let his pain go to waste, shall we? So we're going to see this prophet, Hosea. He's called to marry Gomer. And God says then, this is the woman for you. And I want you to know she's going to absolutely break and trample your heart. And she's going to betray you. She's going to be unfaithful to you. And I want you to marry her. Right? You're a prophet, God tells him, right? You're a prophet. So it's your job to understand me and to know who I am so that you can actually communicate it then to other people and bring the knowledge of God into their lives to change them. So God tells him, then this is how you're going to become my prophet. Because right now, you don't fully understand me. And you really don't yet grasp what I'm going to go through to love human beings. And you're not going to really understand sin and the depths of its wickedness. And you won't fully understand grace. And you won't fully understand my heart until you've been through the very experience of having the person you love most in the whole world absolutely betray you. So God is saying, this is how you're going to become a great prophet, a great preacher, a great communicator that's actually going to be able to touch other people's lives. You're going to have to go through what I'm going through. And so it's not long after Hosea is married to her that she begins to be sexually unfaithful to him. She starts bearing children, and we know for sure, if not all, at least the last two weren't even his kids. In fact, he names the last one, not mine. That's literally what he names that third kid, right? You can see that in verse 9, right? In the ESV, it's trying to say, not my people, but literally Hebrew says, not mine, right? So that was the name. And finally, then, her unfaithfulness just gets worse and worse. Eventually, she just leaves him. She leaves and abandons the kids. She goes off with one man, then with another, and men take advantage of her. They abuse her. She ends up getting just what she deserves because she's so faithless. She's just breaking every promise, and she's looking for fulfillment in other lovers. At the end of chapter 1, which we didn't read on the screen, and then in chapter 2, which we skipped over, but in those chapters, we actually learned something amazing too. And I'm going to put it this way. I'll put it in a story form to help us just get the picture of it. But basically, you've got one day Hosea, and he himself, he comes to the door of the guy that Gomer is currently shacking up with. And he knocks on that door, and out comes a guy, and Hosea says, "Are you the man living with Gomer, the daughter of Diblaim?" And he says, "Yeah." Well, Hosea says, "Well, I'm her husband." And the man probably braces himself, thinking he's going to get punched in the nose, right? But instead, Hosea gives him money. Gives him money. And he says, "I know you're not providing for her. You're just taking from her. You're just using her to get what you want. Well, I don't want her to starve. So here, take this." And Gomer, she doesn't know where the money's coming from that's actually keeping her from her death. Because she assumes that Hosea has just long forgotten about her and wouldn't want anything to do with her anyway. But we learn that when Gomer is cast out from one so-called lover after the next, it's actually Hosea who is secretly taking care of her. Her last lover ends up pimping her out as a prostitute on the streets until he just sees no more value in her. And then he decides to cut his losses, and he's going to sell her into slavery. So at least then he can make a few bucks more on this woman that he now treats as trash. It's about as far down as a person could fall, right? It's about as bad as it could be. It's about as miserable as it could be. And so this is Hosea's really bad marriage. And God says, that's an image of what my relationship with human beings is like. Because he says this in chapter 3, verse 1. He says, "And the Lord said to me, go again, love a woman who's loved by another man and is an adulteress." And what are those next two words? "Even as the Lord loves the children of Israel, though they turn to other gods and love cakes of raisins." Cakes of raisins, by the way, were the delicacies and aphrodisiacs that they were served at the idol feasts, the temporary pleasures of sin. So when God says, your bad marriage When your wife betrays you and puts herself in the arms of other lovers, that's exactly what happens when I love my people and I love human beings and they put other things before me and they worship other gods before me. And God is telling us that you don't understand the impact of your sin on me until you really understand this image, this picture. See, when a king sees a citizen breaking a rule, maybe that makes him angry. Or when a shepherd sees sheep straying, well, shepherds say, well, you know how sheep are. And when a child is seen by his father sees that child as disappointing him, disobeying, well, that's disappointing to the father. But when the person you love most in your life is putting him or herself in the arms of another lover, that's just another level of betrayal. And seeing them seek a lover that actually uses them and hurts them and destroys them, that's another level of heart pain. And God says, until you understand that, until you've been through that, or someone close to you has been through that, you don't understand the impact of your wrongdoing and your coldness and your waywardness on me, God says. And the second thing we're learning is you don't understand yourself and you don't understand the end result of sin. You don't understand sin. And if you think sin is simply the mere breaking of a rule, you haven't got to the depths of it. But when you read about Gomer in chapter 2, you can see she's enslaved to her passions. She's basically a sex addict. And she can't stop herself. She's just a slave to her desires. And God is saying through this image, you're like this bride who's gone away from me to pursue other lovers, other gods who will provide for you temporary pleasure, but in the end will abuse you and despise you and leave you wanting. The prophet Jeremiah also talks like this in his first few chapters, and he calls Jerusalem a treacherous wife who cannot restrain her lust. So what's it mean to follow another god? What's when something is more important to you than God is in your life? If making money is the most important thing, if that's where you get your self-image and who you are, if that gives you more joy than your relationship with God, if having children, if getting married, or if being married, or if it's your looks, or if it's your achievements, if it's momentary pleasure, if it's education, if it's your career, some great political cause, if there's anything more important than God in your life, then that's your real God. That's your real God. And like sex addicts have this inner emptiness. And it's because of that inner emptiness that they have, they're driven then towards this false intimacy of various sorts of sexual practices and pleasure, which don't ultimately satisfy. God actually has the audacity to say here, if you make anything more important than me, doesn't matter be your career, even a good cause, even your family or being married or trying to get married, you're doing the same thing with your soul that a sex addict does with his or her body. You're putting yourself in the arms of something. You have to have it, because if you don't have the money, or if you don't have the love, or if you don't have the romance, or if you don't have whatever it is that's so important to you, that's more important to you than God, you're addicted. And then you've given yourself over to it. It's your lover, but your lovers despise you and enslave you. But they can't save you because they're just idols. They didn't create you. God did. They can't save you. Only God can. And if you build your life around a person, no matter how good he or she is, what happens when he or she is dead? Because your idols can't save you. As the prophet Jeremiah says, you adorn yourself in vain, for your lovers despise you, and they seek your life. And God says, until you understand the absolute devastation of having the person you love most betray you in unfaithfulness, then you don't understand how I feel about your waywardness, about your sin. And you don't even understand your own heart and how addicted and enslaved you are to other things besides me that can never save you. In fact, will only ultimately destroy you and those around you. Lesson number 3. How God redeemed his marriage and what it cost him. So if we look at chapter 3 then, verse 1, it starts out saying, the Lord said to me, go again. So she's left him, right? She's been whoring herself to others, and now she's up for sale. And God says, go again. Go again. God's saying to him, you've got 1,000 reasons for divorce, but I want you to go get her. And that's how God responds to you when you fall back into sin. God says to his son, go again. Go again. And God says, let's show the world what I'm like. Go to her. And so he does. Verse 2 says of Hosea, so I bought her for 15 shekels of silver and a homer and a lethek of barley. So here's Gomer. She's being auctioned off as a slave now in the public marketplace. She'd be stripped naked there so that the bidders can actually see what they're getting. And then the bidding starts. And it's not hard to imagine if you're up front there and you're being bid upon in all her brokenness. She's probably got her eyes closed because I think that's the only way you're gonna shield yourself from the shame and the humiliation. And while her eyes are closed there, she starts hearing the voices. The bidding begins, right? 5 shekels. Do I hear 8? 8 shekels. And she probably doesn't even want to look, so she's got her eyes just closed tightly. She doesn't want to see who's bidding on her. And then suddenly she recognizes one of the voices. It's her husband, Hosea. And she's got to be thinking, what is he doing here? After all I've done, what is he doing here? And the bidding goes on, right? There's 10. I got 10 now. Do I hear 12? There's 12. 15. I got 15. But 15 was all he had. 15 was all Hosea had. So he throws in a homer and a lethek of barley, which would be the equivalent of about 30 shekels. And it's sold to Hosea. Now, who knows what's running through her mind? Like, why did he do this? Why did he do this? Why did he purchase me? Or maybe it's revenge, right? Maybe he's going to get revenge, and so he buys me so he can have his way with me. But Hosea walks up to her, and instead of berating her and treating her like a slave, he actually takes off his cloak, and he covers her nakedness, at least to try to give her back a little bit of her dignity. And then in verse 3, he speaks tenderly to her. And it says in verse 3, and I, that's Hosea, he said, I said to her, you must dwell as mine for many days. You shall not play the whore or belong to another man, and so will I also be to you. So Hosea says, now you come home as mine, not as a slave, but as my wife. And he says not just, you will be mine, right? In other words, I'm the husband here, I bought you, so now you're mine. No, he says, and I will be yours. We belong to each other exclusively. Because Hosea, he's already paid now the financial price, and there's going to be an enormous social and emotional price, especially when all his friends, everyone else in society is going to say, what? Her? After she's been a prostitute? After her betrayal of you? You're going to take her back as your wife? So he's paying the price financially. He's paying the price socially. He's paying the price emotionally. And you got to go, wow, how moving is that? And it's nothing compared to what God has done for you and me. Where did God come in the marketplace? Where does God pay the price to get his wayward, adulterous people back? There's a scene in Matthew chapter 9 where they ask Jesus, and they say, why don't your disciples fast? And he said, Do the friends of the bridegroom fast when they're with the bridegroom? The bridegroom. The bridegroom. Jesus is calling himself the bridegroom. And everybody then knew that the bridegroom of Israel was the Lord himself. The bridegroom of Israel throughout the prophets, throughout the Old Testament, is God. And people say Jesus never claimed to be God. But Jesus is saying, I am that bridegroom. But soon I'll be taken away, and then they'll fast and mourn. I'm the bridegroom, and I've come to die. In Jesus, God entered the world. He entered the marketplace, and he clothed us, covering our nakedness with his righteousness. Because on the cross, Jesus died and paid the price to buy us away from our enslavements, to save us from our self-destruction. So do you know what God is saying to you through Hosea? I mean, poor Hosea. I mean, he had to go through this so I could have this sermon illustration, right? It ruined his whole life. But guess what? It was worth it. Because God is trying to say, Hosea, he just had to go down to the next city, but I had to come from heaven to earth to find you. You weren't seeking me. I had to seek you. I had to find you. And I didn't just have to reach down into my pockets and pull out some money to purchase your freedom. I had to go to the cross. I had to die. I had to pay the penalty for your sin. And look at this sin. I mean, somebody has to pay for it if you were to be rescued. And Jesus says, I took your place. I was stripped naked on a cross so that I could clothe you with a robe of righteousness and say, you come home with me and be mine, and I'll be yours. And when you see, not that, we all have the ability, if we just try hard enough, to go find God, but that's the salvation of the gospel is God seeking us. God finding us when we could not help ourselves and coming to us at infinite cost to himself. I tell you, that'll fill you with holy praise. So God paints a picture with the lives of Hosea and Gomer. And then he sends Hosea to give his testimony to Israel and tell them and to tell us, this is you. You are the whore. And I'm the good, loving, gracious God. Now, if this was a movie or even real life, right? How many of us would just scream at Hosea to leave her? Right? Get out of that relationship. Good riddance, right? She's a no-good whore. She's self-centered. She's narcissistic. She's pursuing her own lusts. I mean, how many of you would try to give Hosea counsel like that? Right? You don't want her back. Right? Don't go after her. Don't keep showing love to her. Divorce her and get out. And that's because we tend to view ourselves as Hosea. But God says, you're Gomer, and I'm Hosea. Not me, that's what God says, right? I'm Gomer. But he says, even in your adultery, I pursue you. So God's love, it's scandalous, right? Any of us in Hosea's situation would have felt perfectly justified in walking away. Sometimes I hear people judge God for having the audacity to judge us, as if his anger towards sin is too harsh. Wow, and aren't you glad God did not look for a loophole to divorce us? His love drove him beyond every requirement of the law. Hosea 11:8 reads this, oh, how can I give you up, Israel? How can I let you go? How can I destroy you like Admah or demolish you like Zeboam? My heart is torn within me and my compassion overflows. Now, I know some people struggle with the song. Sometimes we sing it, Wonderful Name, because it's got the line in there that says, you didn't want heaven without us. And I understand the struggle if you think that God is saying that he absolutely has to have us in order to be happy. But if you look at this verse and others in the minor prophets, God is saying, how could I let you go? There is a sense in which he's bound up his happiness in ours because he set his covenant love upon us. And that's how God feels about us as his spouse. It's clear God doesn't need us. He was and is completely satisfied in the love of the triune fellowship of God. And he would have been totally justified to cast us off and destroy us. But God so loved his people that he brought us into this covenant relationship, and he's bound up his happiness with ours. It's amazing. So last of all, do you really have Jesus in your life as your spouse? Or maybe you just relate to him like some kind of boss, and sin to you is just breaking some arbitrary rules. But if you want the experience of his love in your life, for that life-changing power, then what you have to do is make your vow or remake your vow. That's what the Lord's Supper is basically about. It's kind of like a renewal of your marriage vows that you initially made at your baptism. It's where you say, I, Gomer, take you, Jesus, to be my wedded Savior, my Hosea, and I do commit to not play the whore and give myself to another, but I want to belong to you exclusively and to give you my all because you've already given me your all when you made your vow on the cross. And the ring you wear is even more permanent than one that's tattooed on there. It's the wounds he bears, and he still has those scars today. So what does Gomer do? All right, there's still several more chapters that come after chapter 3. What does she do? Was she melted by his love? Did she go home with him and now they had that faithful covenant relationship? Or did she spurn him again and he goes off and the place is empty? Well, in the book, you can go through the further chapters, but you don't find the answer. It's unanswered. But since you are Gomer, you alone can answer that for yourself. How are you going to respond to the love of your Hosea, Jesus? Are you going to keep running after other lovers and just say good riddance? Because it's not your business what Gomer decides to do. Your business is how are you going to respond to Jesus? If you go with Jesus, you have to become his spouse exclusively. He's the one who's always loved you. He's the one who's provided for you even while you were chasing other lovers. And we'll never rightly see the wickedness of our sin until we understand this illustration and see our sin relationally as the sin of spiritual adultery. And if we don't rightly grasp the nature of our sin, then you won't grasp the wonder of his redeeming grace. And then you won't have your hearts melted by this incredible, scandalous love. And the only way to respond to this love is total. Please don't patronize God with half-hearted commitment or lethargic worship, because he's worthy of more than that, isn't he? So let's respond in the worship of our Hosea, Jesus,